Hi, this is Nick Freitas, and welcome back to Making the Argument. And I've got great news for you. If you've been hanging around listening to this podcast, waiting for that podcast that would probably get me in a ton of trouble with a bunch of people, congratulations, you made it. Here it is, episode 34, and this is the episode where I guarantee I'm going to say a bunch of things or put forward a bunch of theories that is absolutely going to infuriate a number of people. So again, enjoy. We're going to be talking today about the welfare state, and specifically we're going to be talking about the mentality within the welfare state. And I've mentioned an author before named Theodore Dalrymple, which is the pen name for Dr. Anthony Daniels. He worked as a physician and a psychiatrist. He's worked on 4 different continents, but his larger body of work, or what he's known for, especially in what he writes about, has been working in incredibly poor areas within England in the National Health Service and also within the prison system. Again, both as a psychiatrist and also as a physician. And one of the things I find fascinating about his work is that this is a guy that has dedicated his life to helping people, to helping people that find themselves in situations of poverty, of abuse, of having run afoul of the criminal justice system. And his whole goal is to help them improve, to help them improve their situation, to learn more about kind of the mentality behind the decisions that they make, to learn more about their circumstances and how outside factors affected the decisions they made, and really to empower them to be able to do better and make a good life for themselves. So, this idea that this is a guy that doesn't care, or he's some far-flung academic that is, theorizing by all this, by reading Excel spreadsheets and reports as opposed to actually being in the trenches doing the work is absurd, right? This guy spent his life in the trenches trying to help people that he genuinely cared about. But he learned some things along the way, and a lot of the things that he learned and the things that he's written about have really infuriated people on the left. And it's not hard to see why. I'm going to highly recommend his book, Life at the Bottom. This is a series of articles that he wrote spanning several years as he was actively working as a psychiatrist, as a physician, again, within some of the poorest areas of England and within the prison system. And it focuses a lot on the mentality, some of the exchanges that he's had with patients. Now, again, he always makes sure that he's protecting the identity of his patients whenever he's talking about specific exchanges and things like that. But if you really want to get some great insight from someone that has done the hard work, this is a great book to read. Life at the Bottom by Theodore Dalrymple. I highly recommend it. And what we're going to talk about today is some of the experiences that he's had in the book that he writes about, that he talks about, and we're really going to kind of look at how the welfare state affects people's way of thinking about themselves, about their circumstances, about their future. And so we're going to go over a couple of stories. And again, some of these are going to be controversial, and there's going to be ample opportunity for somebody that wants to deliberately misrepresent what I am saying or what I am implying to do so. And so I'm going to be very careful with my wording because, again, my goal here on Making the Argument is to do just that. It's to make an argument, to make a good argument, to define my terms, to be careful in what I say, as Jordan Peterson likes to say, being precise in your speech. So the one thing I would ask for anybody listening to this that might not agree is to give me the benefit of the doubt in so much as I agree with Dr. Daniels that I want people to be able to live out their life to the fullest. And to the degree that circumstances or mentalities are preventing them from doing so, we want to be able to properly identify that so that they can make good decisions for themselves, for their kids, for their families, community, country, etc. Right? So this is all coming from a place of good intentions, right? We may disagree on some of the processes, but I think it's important to take someone like Dr. Daniels seriously when he has, thousands of cases and is relaying stories that affect not only thousands of people, but tens of thousands of people from his personal experience. I think that's worthy of analyzing in order to determine whether or not he makes some good points. And I think he makes some excellent points. So let's kind of go into our first story. He talks about, and again, if you want to get the specifics of this, buy the book, Life at the Bottom by Theodore Dalrymple. I'm going to do some kind of overviews of the stories, but he really gets into the details. He has one story where he's talking about a young woman who was, beaten by her boyfriend. Her boyfriend came in, hurt her, destroyed her apartment, and was, arrested. And now she's in the hospital, and she's getting assistance, obviously, for her physical needs. But then she's also getting assistance too from Dr. Dalrymple, who's also talking to her as a psychiatrist. And one of the things he's trying to do is he's trying to get a good lay of the land for how the circumstances came about where she found herself in this position. And so he starts to learn a little bit more about how she grew up. And obviously she grew up within the welfare system. She grew up in a very poor area. The home life that she had was certainly not a healthy one. And when she started to grow up and she started to engage in relationships with men, it was largely going from one bad relationship to another. And so he asks her, and he asks several women this question because there's numerous articles that he conducts where he says, okay, well, how did this happen? And she describes the event, and she describes the abuse and the violent behavior and the destructive behavior. And then he starts to ask her about, whether or not she's had other relationships like this before. And she tells him that she has. And then he starts to ask her about whether or not she'll continue into this relationship. And she basically tells him that, yeah, she intends to continue into the relationship. And he starts to ask why. Like, why? You know this is a bad relationship. You've been in a bad relationship before. This guy is no good. Why would you go back to him? And she starts to kind of explain about how either she feels an intense passion from him, even though he's being abusive. She feels an intense passion. She feels that, somehow that passion equates to love, because bottom line is, growing up, that was her experience, that anger was associated with affection, that because this guy is horribly jealous and uses abuse as a way to demonstrate that jealousy, that actually translates into a form of caring. One of the interesting questions that he asks her is, if this guy were to enter the room, how long would it take me to know that he was a bad guy? And she looks back at Dr. Daniels and she goes, oh, you'd know instantly. And he goes, okay, well, if I would know instantly that he's a bad guy, he goes, presumably, did you know that he was a bad guy? And she admits that she did. And again, he keeps going with this thread of, so why do you keep making these decisions? And it goes back to a history of abuse within her own life growing up, abuse within the relationships that she has, a desperate need and longing to have relationship and to be cared about and to be valued. But it keeps manifesting itself in this abusive behavior. And one of the things Dr. Dalrymple attempts to do at this point, which I guarantee you would just infuriate the left, is he's trying to get her to see that while what is happening to her is completely unacceptable and is wrong and is not her fault, that she keeps choosing this sort of relationship. And one of the fascinating things that he finds out is that she has had relationships with people that were not abusive, but they actually lasted, a shorter amount of time than the relationships with more abusive people. And he tries to go into the details of why would that be? Why is it that when you do have somebody that is, holds down a job and provides and is affectionate and doesn't resort to abuse, why would that relationship not last as long? And the insight that she gives back is that she doesn't find it as exciting. And, I mean, it's heartbreaking to listen to this, as a basic, good human being, you can recognize that this is a horrible dynamic that is leading to a great deal of destruction. And why would you continue to thrive in it? And one of the interesting components of that whole discussion that he had with her is, again, he came in, destroyed her apartment, harmed her, the whole deal. So now it's not just that she has this abusive relationship that she's continuing with, but the place that she lived, to include her furniture and everything else, has been destroyed. And there was a visiting doctor that was asking Dr. Daniels, how exactly, what's going to happen next? And this is where Dr. Daniels essentially says, well, based off of what I've seen and based off of my talks with her and how this is going to progress, she'll leave the hospital. The welfare state will provide her with a different apartment. They will also furnish that apartment with things like, a couch, a TV, a bed, a refrigerator, microwave, oven, etc. And then at some point, this guy will come back. He will destroy the apartment again. He will abuse her, and the cycle will repeat itself. And you can start to see this dynamic that Dr. Daniels is talking about, that the welfare state is actually contributing to the problem, because it's essentially, it's not providing safe haven from the destructive decisions or from the abusive boyfriend. In fact, it's providing it's providing in some way the ability for it to continue endlessly. And one of Dr. Daniels' big objectives here is to try to get her to think differently about her situation, not to excuse the violence or abuse that she's undergone, but to empower her to be able to make different decisions that are not going to lead to this self-destructive behavior or the destructive behavior of the circumstances that she keeps finding herself in. And discussing how the welfare state, in kind of a tragic way, it is not producing the sort of results that would empower her to make better decisions, but instead is actually making it easier for the same self-destructive behavior to continue indefinitely and affect not only her, but her children. Because now her children are growing up in this environment where their whole view of relationships between men and women is abusive and volatile and violence. And it's just heartbreaking as he's explaining this. But again, the left's critique of his argument is, well, you don't want to do anything. And that's not what he's saying at all. He's saying that no, a big part of this process, in order to, again, empower her, not just provide for basic physical needs, but empower her, it is absolutely essential to get behind the mindset that contributes to the circumstances which keep occurring. Right? Some are somewhat beyond her control, but he's trying to get her to understand that some are within her control, and if she makes different decisions, she can have better outcomes. So, that was one of the stories that I read that I found heartbreaking, not just as a basic, I hope, good human being that abhors any man that would use violence to attempt to control, intimidate, or manipulate a woman, but as a father, as a son, as a brother to 5 sisters, the idea that anyone in my family would be enduring that sort of abuse, I would find that infuriating, and I would look at it as an obligation on my behalf and on my family's behalf to intervene, to be able to help her and pull her out of those circumstances. But what Dr. Dalrymple is talking about is that the welfare state has actually contributed in this case to the breakdown of the family structure so much that essentially the only option that she feels left with is the state. And the state isn't coming in and actually intervening in a meaningful way to get her out of these situations. The state is facilitating these circumstances. And it was a key point that he brings up in his stories. Let's talk about another one that I think is really interesting that goes to the mentality, and this has to do with the work that he was doing within the prison system. And he was talking to somebody that was in prison for murder. They had stabbed someone to death. And so he's sitting down, he's talking to him, he's having them explain their background, how they grew up, their circumstances. He's trying to get a comprehensive picture for all of the different decisions that led up to this point where now this person is in jail for murder. And one of the things that he thought was really interesting, and in fact it's the title of the article, is that when he's describing murdering someone, he describes it, the altercation, and then he says, the knife went in. Now I want you to think about that for a second. He didn't say, I stabbed the guy. He didn't say, I killed the guy, I murdered the guy. He goes, the knife went in. He's actually assigning the agency, not to himself, but to the knife, to an inanimate object. And we see this all the time, whether we're talking about knives or guns or anything else. It's this idea that the knife or the gun or the object is the problem. And that affected the way that he thought about his own action. It wasn't him that made a conscious decision to murder another human being. No, it was circumstances beyond his control which put him in a place where the knife went in. And one of the things that's interesting about this, and Dr. Daniels illustrates this, is that when you start treating criminal activity as if it is almost entirely a result of circumstances or poverty or a failure in some way of the state to intervene, when you treat inanimate objects as if they're the ones with agency instead of the person actually committing the act, when you treat every single criminal activity as if it is a direct result of mental health issues, what you're telling someone is that it's not their fault because they have a mental health issue. It's not their fault because circumstances were not ideal or were even bad. And so as a result, they don't bear responsibility. In fact, as Dr. Daniel says, they have this mentality where it is the state's obligation to cure them. And if the state doesn't cure them, because again, this is all a result of mental health or circumstances, well, then they're not responsible for their actions beyond that. And once again, he's illustrating the fact that these people have been robbed of their own sense of agency, right? It's not their fault. It is somebody else's fault. And because it's somebody else's fault, it's somebody else's responsibility. And because the state keeps reinforcing this idea that it's not their fault, well, then why are they being punished, right? Or why should they be punished for future actions? And again, it's a destructive mindset because it doesn't allow people to come to the conclusion that their actions matter. And I thought that was fascinating. The idea that someone would describe a murder they engaged in as the knife went in. But it doesn't stop there, and he actually delves into some of the earlier circumstances, which creates this sort of mentality. He talks a lot about education. So within the education system within England, obviously within there's poor areas, education is provided for. It is free and compulsory, much like it is in the United States, right? Everyone is afforded an education. But then he starts to talk about some of the cultural dynamics that take place within the classroom, to where you have a student that is desperately trying to study, is desperately trying to use education as a mechanism to be able to climb out of impoverished circumstances, to improve themselves and move on. And he talks about this cultural mentality that goes back to this whole idea of it's not your fault and therefore it's not your responsibility, where now those students which do work diligently to try to improve themselves are actually punished by their peers. It's this idea that working hard and studying is a betrayal of your class or your culture that you were born into. It's not seen as a mechanism for advancement and a mechanism that is open to anybody that's willing to try and work hard. No, it is a betrayal of their social class. And he talks about this with students. And again, it's heartbreaking to watch students that he has discussed, that he has run into as a psychiatrist within the National Health Service, that have gotten to this point where it's not that they don't have the ability, they refuse to demonstrate it because there are social consequences for demonstrating it. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's horrible. What does the educational institution, what does the government-run educational institution do to try to thwart that? And the answer is they don't. In fact, they go the opposite, whether it's about taking qualifications for different tests, whether it's taking about different standards and essentially lowering them because they don't want to hurt the self-esteem of everybody. Well, now you've just told that student that's working very hard, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that they worked hard, because now you're not going to grade the test in a way that actually, holds them up or rewards them for that additional or difficult work. It's all the same, so why try? And it's not just with academics. And let me just back up here real quick. This doesn't mean that if you have a student that has difficulty learning or is dealing with a horrendous home life, that we shouldn't make extra efforts to be able to help that student come along. But the whole strategy there should not be to lower the standards in order to prevent a loss of self-esteem. The solution should be to provide additional help to help them meet the standards. But that's not what's going on in a lot of our government-run systems. That's certainly what was not going on in the school system that Dr. Daniels was describing. And it would be bad enough if it was just the academic standards that were suffering as a result. It actually goes beyond that. Students which actively disrupt the class, to include even intimidating the teacher, are not punished. In fact, teachers, in many cases, are terrified of being able to apply any sort of disciplinary standard within the classroom because it's the teacher that could get punished rather than the disruptive student. And I've actually seen this firsthand as we talk about legislation here in Virginia, where we've tried to lower the standards for disciplinary action. And again, sometimes there's positive intent for that. You'll hear them talk about the school to prison pipeline, but they always talk about the school to prison pipeline as, well, a student did something violent or inappropriate in school, and so they were arrested for it, therefore there's a school to prison pipeline. Well, wait a second. What about every other student in that classroom that was diligently trying to learn, and it was only 2 or 3 students that disrupted the entire learning environment for the 20 other students that were trying to do the right thing? How are they not being victimized by that process? And it's not, again, it is not to say that you can't go back and say, well, those 2 or 3 students that were disrupting the classroom, they're dealing with some situations that are really horrible and that's influencing them. They're only kids. I get all of that. But does that mean they should continue to stay in the same classroom and disrupt that classroom? Or does it mean that they may need to be removed from that classroom, not denied an educational opportunity, but removed from that classroom and placed into an educational environment that can better suit their needs? I mean, if we care about the 2 or 3 students that are disrupting, is the only way to care for them to completely disregard the 20 other students that are not disrupting? But unfortunately, that has been the government approach in many of these educational institutions. And what it has taught students is that if you work hard academically, it doesn't matter because the standards will change and because there's social consequences that you'll pay as a result of intimidation from your peers. And there's no need to actually, listen to your teacher or be respectful or engage in civil discourse because after all, that's not being rewarded. If you're not punishing someone for being disruptive within that educational environment, within those formative years where students are not only learning reading and writing and arithmetic, but they're also learning, positive social interaction. If the disruptive interaction is essentially rewarded by not being, punished or at least called out, then you are teaching every other student that disruptive behavior is perfectly appropriate and may even be an effective way to get what you want. It may be, especially be an effective way to rise, in your status with your peers, since that sort of rebellious nature is now being fostered. And again, Dr. Daniels lays out in kind of vivid detail how this mentality keeps people within the same cycle so that even when those opportunities are being provided, educational opportunities, or even when those opportunities are being provided to meet the physical needs, that now it doesn't free people up to pursue other passions or to improve themselves. Again, it creates a destructive mindset. And it also leads those students to believe that the system is rigged against them because they tried hard, and they didn't receive any reward for it. In fact, they were punished, or they were at the very least neglected. And so once again, it's another question that we have to ask ourselves as we try to reform education, as we try to provide greater opportunities for education, as we try to allow students to be able to escape educational environments that are not conducive to their learning or their future. Why are so many people fighting against that? And again, there's some conclusions on that we're going to talk about at the end here. Another thing I want to talk about is affordable housing. So this is another topic that was talked about. Now we touched on this a little bit, where the woman that had her apartment destroyed by her abusive boyfriend is going to be afforded a new apartment with all the furnishings, regardless of the fact that individual will be accepted back into her life and most likely engage in the same sort of activity and result in another move taking place, right? You might even have sympathy for that situation and want to be able to help, and there's nothing wrong with that. But again, we have to ask ourselves the situation. Why is this continuing? And one of the things Dr. Daniels talks about is the number of patients that he has that when they are applying for an apartment, when they're applying for state assistance for an apartment, they do not encourage Dr. Daniels to write a letter of recommendation on their behalf, highlighting that they would be a good and responsible tenant, highlighting that they will pay their share of the rent on time, highlighting that they will take care of the resources that are being made available, highlighting the fact that they have a job and they are showing up to work on time. No. What they asked Dr. Daniels to highlight is the other circumstances within their life: drug use, suicide attempts, abusive environments, the inability to hold down a job, because this actually gives them a higher status with respect to receiving the funds that they need in order to get the housing. Now, again, you might be thinking to yourself, well, yes, we want the people that are in the worst circumstances to be able to have the funding necessary. That has a lot of superficial plausibility to it. But the other question you have to ask yourself is, what sort of choices is that encouraging? If the only way that you can get the housing subsidy that you need is if you are thinking about suicide or have attempted suicide or are addicted to drugs, what are we encouraging? Right? Is that not a fair question to ask? And yet I know I get in trouble with this all the time in the General Assembly when I always ask the question. I'm like, look, I know what your bill is trying to do, but have you thought about the incentive structure it's creating? I mean, I think it's horrible that in our own welfare state in the United States, You have, hard single working mothers. And again, I was raised largely by a single mother that are working incredibly hard in order to try to rise above and provide their children a better life. But then they get to a certain point and all of their benefits are cut off. Instead of a gradual decline as their economic situation improves, their overall, situation improves, benefits start to come off until it's no longer necessary anymore. We create this cliff to where it is actually more financially advantageous for that single mother to quit her job, lose it, refile for unemployment, refile for daycare benefits, and then go back into the workforce starting at once again a lower level. Like how are we allowing that to exist? Right? Why would we perpetuate a system which tells you that the more attempts you make at self-improvement and the more successful results you have as a result of making good decisions, the more we're going to punish you or deny you the benefits you need to get that little bit extra in order to raise your circumstance? That's now punishment? That now disqualifies you? I mean, that's absurd. Anybody should be able to see on its face that is horribly counterproductive. And I'll tell you who in Life at the Bottom does recognize it as being horribly counterproductive. Visiting physicians. One of the things that, again, was really eye-opening was that Dr. Daniels works with physicians that come from places like Mumbai, comes from places like Manila. And I've been to Manila and or like Dhaka, Bangladesh, which is another place I've been. And I mean, just abject poverty. Poverty in a sense that very few people within the Western world who have not seen it and more importantly experienced it can possibly appreciate. Right? When we talk about the poor in the Western world, we're typically talking about people that still have access to a house and a smartphone and a TV and an oven and a refrigerator. All of those things generally exist on some level. We're not saying that it's great, but when you talk about poverty in places like Dhaka, Bangladesh, or Mumbai, India, or Manila, Philippines, that is a totally different world. We're talking about people living on dirt floors with shacks that have very, very little economic opportunity. That in many cases, if their 12-year-old child is not working, well, that 12-year-old child represents 20% of the family's income, and they will starve to death if the child doesn't work. That's the sort of poverty that these doctors are coming from, and then going to the UK and working within the National Health Service. And one of the things Dr. Daniels observed was that when they first get there, they think to themselves, oh my gosh, this is I think he referred to it as the apex of civilization. I mean, here it is, no matter how poor someone is, or no matter what their financial circumstances, they can always get access to education, to healthcare, to housing, to food, et cetera, all provided for by the state. And their initial impression is, this is great. But what inevitably ends up happening is that over the several months that they're there working within the National Health Service, they inevitably come across somebody that comes into the hospital and maybe they had a drug overdose or whatever it was, but they receive careful attention from the medical staff. They receive the treatment that they need in order to improve themselves. And the whole time that they're there, they're heavily abusive, both verbally and physically, to the medical staff. And these visiting doctors are looking at this going, how are these people not grateful or thankful for the care that they're receiving at no charge to themselves? Because in many cases, the people that are receiving this care, they're not even paying taxes, right? They're net tax beneficiaries, which is to say any tax that they might pay as far as sales tax or VAT tax or anything like that, they're getting way more than that in terms of payments from the government. And they don't understand, like, why is the mentality of many people, not everyone, right? Again, for anybody that's listening that's looking for something they can cut and say, oh, Nick doesn't care. No, they're not claiming everyone, but it's a lot of people that don't have a sense of gratitude to these things. They have a sense of entitlement to them. Well, if you're entitled to something, you don't feel any sense of gratitude for it. And again, that's another condition created by the welfare state and by the politicians that push it. It's this idea that you having access to education or healthcare, that these aren't services that are being provided by somebody else that had to work hard in order to make it possible. No, these are your rights. These are your rights. Now, I've talked about in other episodes how you can't have a right to the property or labor of somebody else. To do so is to essentially, subject somebody else to slavery in order to meet your own needs. You can't have a right to those things. You can't have an inherent right. You can have a contractual right, but you can't have an inherent right. And one of the dangers on treating commodities and services, whether it be something like healthcare, education, as if it is a basic human right, is that to not get it is now to be denied your rights. And to get it is not to feel any sort of gratitude toward the people that had to work to make those things possible. It's to believe that, nope, you're just entitled to this. And of course this is the way it's supposed to be. And so these doctors over several months, witnessing, the mentality within the welfare state, the mentality within, the hospitals they're working on. One doctor even came back and said, I deal with a lot of poverty in my home country, but the degenerative nature of this welfare state is something that I haven't seen before, and I think it's horribly corrosive to the human spirit. And I think he's absolutely right. So, when you look at all of these things, the question is, if we're serious about wanting to help people, then the welfare state is a relatively simple answer. One of the things that people always ask, which I find to be an odd question, is they'll say, why is there so much poverty in the world? What I like to remind people of, and this isn't my idea, this is just kind of standard economics, poverty is the natural state of mankind. To ask why there is poverty is to ask why is there sunshine? It's because poverty is the natural state. The more important question is why is there wealth? And what sort of activities and behaviors lead to producing wealth? And how do we foster that mentality? That's one of the most important things that you can do. You can't always have control over your circumstances, but you can make the best of certain circumstances. You can make better decisions and improve your situation, and especially in environments where you're being afforded special opportunities that most of the world can only dream of. Taking advantage of those things is critical, but it only works if someone has the mentality and recognizes it as an opportunity, not something that's being given to them, but an opportunity for them to put in their side of the work, their side of the effort, in order to improve their situation. But why would they ever do that when the very welfare state that is supposed to be charged with providing those opportunities creates the perverse incentives and ultimately destroys their own sense of agency? And that's what Dr. Daniels is talking about when he talks about the worldview which creates the underclass. So again, as I read through Life at the Bottom and I read through these stories, the thing that really impresses upon me as someone that, again, I do genuinely care, not just about my own success, I care about my neighbor's success. My faith not only suggests that, it commands it of me. But I don't approve of systems which rob people of their agency, punish them every time they engage in constructive behavior which improves their situation, and essentially leads them to believe that the only way that they can get ahead is if some government agency is stealing from somebody else in order to give it to them. Or that the reason why they can't get ahead is because the system is rigged against them. Now, this is not to say that there haven't been times in history where systems have been legitimately rigged against certain people. You look at Jim Crow laws in the United States. You look at the institution of slavery. You look at other laws which were deliberately racist or prejudiced against people for things like skin color or gender. Those are bad, and we should all work together in order to remove those, because the government should be the last institution on the planet imposing those kinds of destructive apparatus on people that prevents them from making their life everything that it could be. But unfortunately, the welfare state, which sought, I think, in many cases to make up for past discrimination and for past policies which were destructive, have instead created new incentive structures which are destructive in and of themselves. And the question is as we look at the welfare state in the United States and England and all over the world, and Thomas Sowell has also done a lot of great work on looking at the welfare state, the mentality, and the sort of results it's produced. We can see empirically that it has done a lot of damage. It has done a lot of damage to the family structure. It has done a lot of damage within the educational institutions. It has done damage within healthcare institutions. And we can see empirically how it has done horrible damage to people that have now lived for generations within the welfare state and don't see any possibility of being able to escape it, to be able to be financially independent, to be able to truly take control of their own life, because they have been convinced through one way or another, whether destructive incentives within the welfare system, or whether it's a constant political mantra that they don't have the ability to rise above their circumstances, that only politicians can create the environment for them to do so. And the only way that the politicians can do it is by having more power to take from one person and redistribute to another. Regardless of what you want to look at, all of that has had destructive results. I mean, yet you can always point to someone that, okay, maybe they didn't have a particular commodity or service, and now that they do. Okay, yes, that might have been a limited improvement. You might have made someone slightly more comfortable in their poverty, but have you equipped them with the mechanisms to truly escape it? And if you haven't done that, then I'm going to start to wonder why you persist in supporting such an institution. Why do politicians insist on supporting and advocating and advancing certain concepts, certain welfare systems, which we know have counterproductive results? Why would you do that? And for this real quick, I want to talk about a story that Thomas Sowell actually shares, where Thomas Sowell used to be a Marxist. And what cured him of that was the first year he worked for the government. He was working for the Department of Labor, it was either the Department of Labor or Agriculture, and he was working, and they were looking at the minimum wage in Puerto Rico. And Dr. Sowell came up with this test in order to determine whether or not the minimum wage would actually increase the overall living standards and economic productivity within the area, or if it would actually hurt. And what he found is that the agency had no interest in whether or not the minimum wage increases and these additional subsidies would assist, because their jobs were dependent upon those subsidies. And that's where it clicked for him. The government agencies that have been set up to alleviate poverty, or to help with housing, or to assist with education, or to assist with transfer payments or redistributive policy, they may start off with good intentions, but once they become their own agency with millions and sometimes billions of billion-dollar budgets, they now have their own motivations and their own incentives, and their incentive is to increase their budget, increase the staff, increase the scope of the work that they conduct, and none of that is necessarily associated with achieving a better result for the intended recipient. And it is important to understand that dynamic of this entire discussion, that once you create that agency, the agency has a motivation for self-preservation just like any other entity. And if we stop looking at what sort of systems, what sort of programs, what sort of transfer payments, which ones are helping people escape poverty, if we only look at how big is the agency budget, how many people are being served, if we only look at that, then we are creating a situation where agencies are now dependent upon other people's dependency. And that is immoral. And so I think we would be wise, again, if you're serious about helping people, not simply become slightly more comfortable within their poverty, but if you're actually interested in helping them get to a position where they are financially independent, where they are truly in control of their own life, then we're going to have to look at some of the destructive mentalities that have been created within our welfare system. I'm not saying get rid of everything. I'm saying, how do we reform? And how do we also appreciate that the greatest mechanism for creating genuine welfare, and I don't mean welfare in a sense of a program, I mean welfare in the sense that people are happy, healthy, prosperous, and free. Then we're going to have to go back to understanding the importance of the family structure. We're going to have to get back to the idea of understanding that people helping people and not delegating our responsibility to some faraway government agency that doesn't care whether or not the person is helped. They only care about what money they're moving around. Families, community, churches, civic organizations. And I've shared my own story before. I know what it is to need financial assistance. And I am so grateful that when I did, I had family, friends, and a church community that was willing to step up and help. Because it fostered a very, very different mentality in myself. It wasn't one of entitlement. Because I was very conscious of the fact that none of those people had to help me. I was very conscious of the fact that they actively chose to help me because they cared about me and that they sacrificed in order to help me. This wasn't money that just appeared out of thin air. They gave up something in order to help me meet a need. And so therefore, when I was in a better situation moving forward, I am very cognizant of what it's like to be in that situation and very aware of my obligation to help someone out just like I was helped. But that doesn't create the same mentality. That is what we want. We want a sense of community. We want a sense of personal responsibility. We want a sense of love thy neighbor. But I'm not seeing a whole lot of that within our current welfare state. I'm seeing a lot of destruction. I'm seeing a lot of people that appeal to the welfare state for either out of the ignorance of the destructive behaviors that it helps foster at times, or simply because it makes them feel better as if they're doing their part because they're paying taxes, and so now they can ignore that when their neighbor's in distress. Or I'm watching the people that financially benefit or benefit through power structures within politics by propping up and perpetuating these systems regardless of the failures of them. So again, this is not an argument to simply tear down the welfare state. This is an argument to say that if we really care, then we have to be open and honest that sometimes, many times with government, good intentions produce bad results. And when those bad results can be so clearly and empirically analyzed, when those results manifest themselves in the sort of stories that someone like Dr. Daniels, that has worked for decades in this environment, can easily share and convey to us, then it's time for us to start looking for alternatives that will empower people by incentivizing those good decisions that they want to make, but are currently getting punished for within the welfare state. I'm Nick Freitas with Making the Argument. Again, I told you this was going to be a controversial one. I have no doubt we're going to get some interesting comments, but I'm very, again, please believe me, I'm very sincere when I say that I do want us to foster a loving community, which is inclusive and which is willing to make amends for past sins of society, but does so in an effective way to create a freer society. Again, if the overall goal is for people to be happy, healthy, prosperous, and free, then we've got to be honest about what works and what doesn't work, what programs have been successful and which ones have not, what sort of mentalities foster the sort of results we want to see, and what sort of mentalities destroy the sort of results that we'd like to see. Thank you again for joining us. Please give us a like and share on whatever social media platform you're watching this on. One of the most effective ways that you can make sure that these ideas are shared with other people is to actually give us a 5-star rating and write a review for us. That is the currency of podcasting. So once again, thank you for joining us. Leave us your comments. I do read them. I try to interact with them, and leave us some ideas for what you would like to see on a future show of Making the Argument. Thanks again.